Why do we protest? The term itself is described as action expressing disapproval. For some, that disapproval is connected to reflection over the loss of an election. See, that feeling of rejection, it leads to a projection of words and signs highlighting our objections. But take note, that anger over what feels like a wasted vote is just a footnote in the words Mother Protest wrote. No, I'm not trying to promote one life over the other, but simply sympathize with the mother that had to bury their child simply because their skin was a different color. Whether black, white, Asian, Hispanic, or Native American, we march because no fight for change is too small. We march because instead of helping those in need, we're building walls. We march because we recall being stripped of our lands, freedom, and safety. You feeling me, y'all? We march because when we speak of justice, we need to make sure it's justice for all. Welcome to another episode of Justice for All Beyond the Cut. I'm your host and executive producer, Nathaniel Paul. I want to first thanking you, our viewers at home, for giving us your time today for another important discussion on a number of different topics on things that are impacting our community, our state, and our nation. Our primary topic of discussion today, HB1. It's not a new virus strain. This is actually one of our state's newest laws, and it's been nothing short but controversial. You've probably seen headlines, you've seen stories, you've seen tweets, you've seen videos shared on social media of what this law is and what it isn't. So today, I want to clear up any misconceptions, any confusion, any misinformation that's been shared. And I've invited a number of guests to help me do that today, starting with the one on my left and the one on my right. We have Mr. Bernie Jacques, conservative activist, former state prosecutor, running for state representative. To my left, Representative Fentress Driscoll, House District 63. Thank you both for giving us your time to be able to discuss this very important topic. I want to jump right in. I know we're eager to talk, and I also know we're eager to get our hair cut because we're in the barber shop, but we're going to have to save that for the end, all right? I can tell your hair looks lovely. You're good. And I think you got a couple weeks before.
Yeah.
You know,
I got some time.
We're good. We're good. All right. A lot to discuss. Yeah. HB1. Representative Driscoll, I'm going to come to you. Before you even give me your personal feelings about this law, for our viewers watching at home, because for them, this might be their very first time even hearing about this, what do they need to know about Florida's anti-riot law?
Well, thank you for having me today, and thank you so much for the conversation. It is important for our viewers to educate themselves, and I'll give you a summary, but for everyone who's out there in TV land, if you want to take a look at it yourself, you can do so. Just visit the Florida House website, myfloridahouse.gov, and you can see really all of the bills that we worked on this legislative session, including House Bill 1/Senate Bill 484, which is the anti-riot legislation. And so with this bill, the legislature took measures to strengthen penalties for a number of crimes that were already on the books, but these crimes are enhanced, and it actually does create some new crimes. But for example, now there's the crime of mob intimidation, which is punishable by up to a year in prison. And that's when a group of 3 or more try to threaten or intimidate another to abandon their viewpoint. There are enhanced penalties for aggravated rioting and for inciting a riot. There also now are enhanced penalties for damaging a monument or memorial or destroying a monument or memorial, as well as a new penalty or harsher penalties for cyber intimidation. Some of that, people out in the TV land may know this as doxing, when you are publishing another's personal information on the internet without their permission, things that may be very personal and personal identifying information. So that's another aspect of the bill. And then I guess finally I would mention that it creates an affirmative defense. And basically this means, let's say for example, if you and I were participating in a protest that turned violent and law enforcement perceived that to be a riot. And let's say I was in my vehicle and I was trying to get through traffic, but you were participating in that protest that was deemed a riot. If I were to run you over or somehow injure you, and you were to sue me for medical damages or whatever damages that you had, the judge would be able to grant me a stay in that case and wait to see if you are convicted of having participated in a riot. If you are convicted of having participated in a riot, then I don't owe you any damages, which is just a fundamental departure from generally how we handle things under a criminal and civil law in the United States. So that's a broad overview of HB1.
Thank you so much for that. Bernie hit on a lot of different points. Again, not sharing your personal feelings just yet, but is anything else you feel that our viewers need to know about this law?
Yeah, the representative did a good overview of what the law does. When we talk about local control, what it does is it stops this movement we've seen quite a bit about defunding the police. And so we saw it across the country and where a lot of these cities were stripping funds from their police officers. Ironically, a lot of them actually kind of came back and say, hey, maybe we went too far. And what this bill does, it scrutinizes that here in Florida to make sure that police funding is not being taken away from communities. Law enforcement and public safety is a state function. And so the state has a very compelling, strong interest to make sure that cities are not leaving their citizens less safe by defunding. And so that's that element there. But yeah, basically it just cracks down on what most people can agree, that peaceful protests, fine, that's enshrined in our Constitution. But when it gets violent and it turns to looting and just lawlessness, it must be stopped. And this law sends a very strong message that this won't happen in Florida.
So let's now give our thoughts about how we personally feel about this. You were in Tallahassee during this debate. What was your take on this legislation and from the minute it was introduced and now that it has been signed into law?
So the story of HB1 goes back further than when it was introduced on January 6th. The governor would have you believe that it was in response to that insurrection, but that absolutely makes no sense. If we'd had HB1 on the law, HB1, if it was already the law of the land, it would not have stopped that insurrection. That insurrection was started because a president lied and incited violence. The protests that were held throughout the state of Florida overwhelmingly were peaceful, and throughout the nation, studies show over 90% of them were. HB1 would not have prevented those that turned violent. When people get to that point in their minds, I don't know what you can do, really to stop them. Furthermore, it's unnecessary as a law because law enforcement already had the tools that they needed to arrest people who were engaging in violence. And they did just that, and they did a good job of that. And my hat's off to our law enforcement community who work so hard to protect us every day, even though that means putting themselves in harm's way.
Do you agree with that notion? Because we've heard that on social media, we've heard that on just stories that we've done on air, or people feeling that this is targeting Black and brown communities. Do you agree with that notion?
I don't agree with that. I'll expand on that more, but before I do so, I just want to push back a little bit on the claim that the former President Trump incited a riot. There was a trial held, as we know, and the United States Senate did acquit him of such a charge, and that's why the impeachment effort was not successful. That's why he was not removed. But regarding whether this targets Black and brown people, I don't think so at all. I mean, this is a very racial, colorblind law. The law is the law. It doesn't say if you are Black or brown and you commit these offenses, here are your penalties. It says anybody who goes and blocks traffic, who damages property, who harms our police officers. That's a big component of the bill as well, committing battery on our police officers, where we did see that during the riots last summer, and intimidate people who are just going about their business. They will be punished accordingly. And it doesn't matter if you're white, Black, or in between.
So why do you feel there is that feeling then? Because like you're saying it's not, and many say it's not, but for those in the Black and brown communities, that's not how they feel. And they've been very vocal about that in demonstrations and marches we've seen since the signing.
Well, I don't think you can just paint a broad brush on a whole community based on very vocal activists, right? And so you have a lot of people perceive extreme elements within the BLM movement and so forth who want to do things like defund the police. Mind you, 81%, it's a strong number, 81% of Blacks who were polled said they do not want the police to be defunded. But you would not have known that if you have just heard from BLM leaders. And so I don't think we can just go off what activists are saying and just to make a point that that's how all Black people feel. This benefits Black and brown people. A lot of the looting and the rioting we've seen a lot of times when something happens sometimes at communities of color. It's businesses, minority owned, sometimes are getting burned down to the ground. it's grocery stores that brown and black people shop at who are no longer in operation because they've been burned to the ground. I recall seeing an interview, I believe this was in Minneapolis, older black woman was in tears because of all the rioting and the looting and the carnage that occurred. She said, I can't even shop. This was my grocery store. Where am I gonna go? And in a situation where we have all these like food deserts and disparities in certain communities of color where there aren't some of these options, but then these businesses are the ones getting burned to the ground a lot of times, I don't think that's bad when it comes to this law for the community, because I think this law will benefit communities of color because it sends a strong message that we will not tolerate businesses to be looted and people to be harmed.
One of the things that you mentioned is that this was designed to protect businesses, property. Coming up after the break, we're going to bring on a business owner who owns Conservative Grounds Coffee Shop, a Trump-themed coffee shop. We're going to hear his perspective and his thoughts on this law. You're watching Justice for All Beyond the Cut. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Justice for All Beyond the Cut. You're watching our latest installment. We're having a discussion about one of Florida's newest laws, the anti-riot law. And joining our conversation right now, Cliff Gephardt. Cliff, thank you for joining our discussion today.
Thank you for having me.
You've heard the discussion thus far. I want to start off first with just your thoughts on everything you've heard.
You know, you mentioned I'm a business owner. I'm one of the founders of Conservative Grounds. And I think when there's chaos and rioting and protesting, as somebody who's been affected by that, I think it does affect people's businesses, affects people's livelihoods, but it doesn't affect the businesses. It affects the people who work for the business, the community that they're in. And I think it sends a strong message that we should have order and, control of our communities. If you look at the chaos rioting capital of the world, which is Portland, Oregon, most of those riots are done by, in my opinion, the Antifa, and they're not people of color. They're destroying, and that's the riot capital of America, it seems like, in Portland. So I think we should have order, we should have control. People should be able to express their views. People should be able to express their opinions, but it should not encroach on other people's lives, like blocking roads, allowing people to get home, getting to their families. Those things should be stopped immediately. And up until now, if you look in, especially in our area, roads were blocked, bridges were blocked. In my community, the bridge was blocked where people couldn't even get to their houses. There was alternate ways, but it would take a much greater distance for them to travel. And I'm glad that we protected our citizens with this bill.
So to be clear, you are in favor of this legislation?
I'm in favor of all legislation that makes our cities and our communities safer.
Now, did you come to that conclusion based on the stuff that the governor mentioned that happened in 2020, some of the protests that you mentioned in Portland, or because you yourself were in DC this year when the riot took place? So is it a combination of both, of what you witnessed in DC and what you've seen on TV, or are you going based on one or the other?
I think it's just rational thought. I was in DC, and when some of the things escalated beyond what I thought was a protest, I left because I didn't believe in those things. And the people that are held accountable for those should be held accountable. And I have no problem with that. But it's also some of the things that have happened in St. Petersburg, where people are disrupting diners, they're closing down bridges, they're closing down roads. And your rights end where mine start to be infringed on. And I think that's what this law says, is it says that, once you start blocking roads, you can protest, you can stay on the sidewalk, but when you start blocking roads, disrupting businesses, disrupting my, life, then I think that's where it needs to stop. And I think my position didn't start after January 6th. It didn't start, last year when Portland was burning down. It started from just rational thought that this is wrong. And if you can't see that this is wrong, that we shouldn't stop chaos, then I think that's a position that nobody should have.
Representative Driscoll, your response.
Well, of course, everyone's entitled to their opinion, right?
Sure.
Like, that's what makes this country so great. That's what makes the First Amendment so wonderful. And so even like taking off my hat as a legislator and just putting on my hat as an attorney, as a lawyer, that's my day job, I get very concerned when we as a government start passing legislation that could potentially infringe on people's First Amendment rights. Because in as much as I cited my belief that the governor's, the impetus for this bill was the Black Lives Matter protests, you have to consider that people in this country, because we have such broad freedom of speech, protest all sorts of things. So you have people who protest at abortion clinics. You have anti-abortion protesters. You have people who support the Second Amendment right to bear arms who protest. And so to me, I think we also have to take a broader view of this bill. It actually is not just going to hurt communities of color, although I do believe it's targeted at them. It has the potential to hurt us all. And when you look at that crime of mob intimidation, you are on a very slippery slope, because it says if you are threatening or attempting to get someone to change their viewpoint, I mean, what does that mean? We have opposing viewpoints, and if three of my friends and I are having a discussion and it gets a little heated, are we now facing a charge for mob intimidation? Whereas with the protests that were violent, you had law enforcement on the scene doing what they needed to do. This is not a bill that law enforcement needed in order to do their jobs. This is a bill that sends, I think, the wrong message to communities of color, but we have yet to see how everyone is going to be captured in this very broad, I think, overbroad net.
Cliff, one sec. I know you have a lot to say. Bernie, we're going to get you in this conversation as well. We got to pay the bills. We got to take a break. We have talked about the protests and activists. So we have someone that's coming on that has organized marches and demonstrations. We'll hear their perspective after the break. You're watching Justice for All Beyond the Cut.
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace.
Welcome back to Justice for All Beyond the Cut. You're watching our latest installment. We're having a discussion today about Florida's anti-riot law, and boy, have we touched on a number of things so far. We're about to take it to another level. We have Ashley Green from Bay Area Dream Defenders. Ashley, I saw you from the corner. I can tell you've been eager to join this discussion. So let's just start first with just your reaction of everything that you've heard so far.
You know, I'm not going to lie, it's not things that I find surprising. We always are more eager to police and judge the reaction than we are the very reason why people are out here protesting. And time again, we see people who would rather prioritize businesses over Black lives, which is why we have had to protest so consistently. And, you know, the same mischaracterizations I think I expected. I have been a part of protests since I was a teenager. I started out as an anti-war activist and protesting for anti-bullying policies in schools because gay kids were getting targeted and then getting penalized and punished. And I've continued on in my adult life protesting for a lot of things, between union rights, Black lives, justice, and for families who have lost loved ones to gun violence. I think protest is one of the most fundamental rights that we have as citizens, which is why it is one of the first rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights. And so to hear things like St. Pete be, characterized as the Florida Portland, is a little baffling. We protested for over 140 days last summer without a single bit of property damage, and the only violence that was done to us, the only threats of violence were done to us. And none of those people were held accountable. A gun was pulled on us on camera. None of those people were held accountable. And yet, bridges are, again, inconvenience, again, is more important than addressing the systemic reasons that we came out to protest in the first place. You know, the rationale that people shouldn't be inconvenienced is the same rationale that led to Bloody Sunday, when John Lewis and Martin Luther King took over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and when hundreds of people were beaten for trying to exercise the right to vote and wanting to see voting rights in Alabama and across the country. We see these same patterns over and over again, where we would rather address what makes us uncomfortable than the injustice that brings people out to protest. And I'm disappointed to see such a cavalier attitude towards protests, especially when we're talking about rioting as a measure of what law enforcement decides whenever they decide. It's not as if there's a clear legal definition of when police will deem something to be unlawful. It's at their discretion. And as somebody who was tear gassed and maced and fired out with rubber bullets last summer for, again, protesting when there was no violence, I can tell you that that discretion is oftentimes not valuable. That discretion oftentimes leaves people being more fearful of exercising their First Amendment rights than hopeful for justice being served.
I want to piggyback off of what you just said, because you said being fearful, and that has been, Bernie, some of the feeling of this law. People feel that this is an intimidation to discourage people from protesting. So your reaction to that and everything that Ashley just said?
Sure, and to be clear, I respect people who protest. It's peacefully protest. It's the American way. It's in our First Amendment. That is accurate. But to compare what MLK and John Lewis was doing to what we saw over the summer, I think is wildly inaccurate, and it doesn't do them due justice, these civil rights icons. I never saw MLK or John Lewis harming a police officer. I never saw MLK or John Lewis taking a TV out of a store. I never saw MLK or John Lewis burning a Champ store like we saw in Tampa. So there's two different things. If you want to do a compare and contrast with what we think is permissible versus what is not, it's what I just described. What they did in the civil rights era, that's good. That's peaceful. And it led to positive changes. You know, we're here because of that. We're beneficiaries of that. But we're not beneficiaries of somebody burning down stores or harming police officers or intimidating somebody just trying to have dinner, you know, down on Beach Drive in St. Pete or at the pier. That does not lead to change. That leads to more chaos, and that's why these laws are needed.
Ashley, I'm going to get your reaction to everything he just said.
I would love to.
I'm going to get your reaction, and we're going to bring Cliff back on in this discussion. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss this next part of the conversation. You're watching Justice for All Beyond the Cut. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our latest installment of Justice for All Beyond the Cut. By now, you know we're talking about Florida's anti-riot law. We are about to get really knee-deep on this part of the discussion. Bernie, you hit on some very interesting points just now, and Ashley, I know you wanted to respond, so let's dive right in.
What bothers me about HB1, and I think Representative Driscoll touched on this earlier, is that it's a distraction. It's not actually something that we needed to be worrying about in Florida in the middle of a pandemic, when we did have overwhelmingly peaceful protests. When every time I led a protest, we started with a nonviolence training, when we started with talking about being disciplined, being respectful, being mindful, when we had safety marshals in place. And that's why we were able to protest for over 140 days, again, with no property damage and no violence to anyone done except to us. And so again, equating us and saying we're not worthy of the legacy of King, when we're literally practicing strategic nonviolence, when we're not worthy of the legacy of Lewis, is insulting. I don't just protest around police. I protest around a lot of things. The people at the Pinellas County School Board know me well because I've been fighting for equity and education. The people down at City Hall know me well because I fight for youth services, because I protest for my community, to see affordable housing, to see justice across the board. And overwhelmingly, those protests, while being peaceful, at some point in time have been deemed unlawful because of the ways in which people are uncomfortable by things like street closures. Now, hey, we can argue about the efficacy of that, but that is not as important as having the discussion about why are people protesting in the first place.
Bernie, I want to give you a chance to respond, and then Cliff, we're going to bring you in on this conversation.
Right, again, it's two different things. If you're doing all of those things you described, then you have nothing to worry about. The law doesn't punish any of those things. What the law punishes is when this group that sometimes may start peaceful, and then you have some people, you know, go a different route, and they want to get violent. And those people who want to get violent, those people who want to get destructive, the law brings out enhanced penalties for these individuals who do a disservice to what you described. And this is what this conversation needs to be. It doesn't need to be an indictment on people's right to address grievances and to protest, as is their constitutional right. It needs to be focused on the bad actors, and we saw plenty of them. It's well documented. As much as we like to ignore it, we did see cities burn last summer. We can't unsee it.
What Florida city burned? What Florida city burned?
And I'll say this, Florida did much better. Thank goodness to our great governor who sent a strong message that we will not tolerate these type of things in Florida, but there were still some flare-ups, there were still some incidents.
Thank goodness to our protesters.
I referenced the Champ store in Tampa being burned down.
That wasn't a protest.
I mean, right, so this punishes that.
But there wasn't a protest there.
All right, let's
That wasn't a
Cliff,
protest.
Cliff, go ahead and weigh in real quick.
In your description, you mentioned the word protest several times. I lost track of how many times you said the word protest. This law has nothing to do with protesting. This law is an anti-rioting bill. So your narrative about protesting, nobody's saying that you shouldn't protest. And all the things you say you've done should be applauded. But the reality is that everybody who organizes these things or participates in these things does not go to the same level you do or take the same precautions. So this bill is the anti-rioting bill, not the anti-protesting bill. So it really has no relevance to what you do.
This bill was a response to protest.
This
and,
bill-
and the use of the word riot is a false flag. Who determines a riot? A riot is when a protest is deemed to be unlawful.
You just determined
And that is
it.
at the discretion of police. Now again, you're talking about I don't have anything to be fearful. I literally watched as my friend in front of me was ran over by a car. And this law does more to make sure that people feel empowered to hit somebody. We were on a side street next to a Winn-Dixie with no oncoming traffic that was being blocked, praying when a car approached and decided to hit and drag a protester a mile down the road. And who got arrested? That protester. And we had to work with the state attorney's office to make sure that his right to protest was protected more than the vehicle who got off scot-free and left home. I have a right to be afraid because I have seen these things happen over and over and over again. It's not an illegitimate fear. It's again rooted in firsthand experience.
So what this
Okay,
bill,
wait. Let's pause real quick, because you said a lot of things there, and I want to get our representative in because she was in Tallahassee and knows all the details of everything that's being said. Quick fact check, because at the end of the day, we're still trying to educate our viewers at home. So I want to make sure within our opinions that we're given the right information. Everything that you've heard so far, are we on point with what we're saying, and just your reaction of everything what we're talking about?
I guess I would just say that the challenge is, and we weren't able to get clear answers from the bill sponsor about this, and the answers changed from committee stop to when we were on the floor about when exactly that trigger would come into effect, that it would be deemed a riot, for example, or mob intimidation. And so the concern that I have with the legislation that many of us have is that it is vague, because you're right, if you're peacefully protesting, then you don't come under the auspices of any crime, whether it's HB1 or crimes that were already on the books. But the challenge is, and we weren't able to get the clarity about what happens if you are a part of a peaceful protest and one part of it becomes violent, then is the whole thing deemed to be, to be a riot? And depending on which day you ask the bill sponsor, the answer could be yes or no. Depending on which day you asked what counts as that intimidation factor we were talking about changed. He said, for example, that it could, the bill sponsor in the House said, for example, it could mean something like you threw a bottle and you missed. But if you talk to criminal law experts, they'll tell you that assault doesn't require you to throw something and miss. It could maybe be raising a fist. It could be it could be many things. So yes, kind of right, but I guess the lack of clarity is what happens if it's a peaceful protest and one part of it becomes violent. Then is everybody caught up in that net? And I think the answer is yes.
I think that's the point here, because there is a lack of clarity. So you feel one way, and then you're saying that for protesters that there's a fear, because you're saying that what she's doing should be fine. Well, but she feels fearful, and the group that she's working with is fearful because of the vagueness of this legislation.
well, when I was in DC and things got to a point where I didn't think they should be, I made the conscious decision as a person to not be a part of that, and to leave. I actually left. I left the plaza, I left the area. And I think that's what all people should do. If you're involved in something and it starts going wrong, you know, whether it's a carjacking or whatever crime starts to be committed in your presence, not rioting, it could be stealing, your friend could steal something. You need to leave. You need to remove yourself from the situation, like all crimes. And that's all this is saying, is that if you're involved in a protest and it becomes a crime, you need to remove yourself, and they're trying to identify what the crime is.
Let's turn off
That's
that.
what I believe.
So you said that you have conversations with your marchers before you go
Absolutely.
out. So and when those type of scenarios come out, especially now with this legislation being law, what are any changes to tactics? Any changes to your approach now as you organize these demonstrations?
So traditionally, what we have served as of not just doing these trainings, but also making sure that we have a safety team and safety plan in place, is that we work to de-escalate tense situations. So we've had many situations in which people have tried to accost us, start violence, threaten us physically, and had knives and guns pulled on us. And we try and actively work to de-escalate those situations. Now, under threat of a felony, we're not going to take those actions to de-escalate. And we've been very successful, again, at preventing violence by taking those measures. But that threat is I don't want to lose my right to vote. I'm not going to get a felony conviction if I can avoid it. I think additionally, this bill is also going to punish, though, the organizers of protests. So if there is a bad actor that comes into a protest with the intention of starting violence, this bill makes those organizers culpable for any violence or damage that happens. And that's really, again, that chilling effect of, I can't control all the different elements. I can do everything that I can to uphold my values, to practice strategic nonviolence, to prioritize people's safety and people's rights. But at the end of the day, if somebody comes with ill intention, I now have been decentivized by penalty of a felony from intervening in those situations and working to keep people safe. And that fundamentally makes everybody less safe. That fundamentally makes everybody less likely to actually utilize their right to protest. Because when you show up at a protest and you don't know what can happen or who could be harmed, but you're under the threat of the penalty, you're going to be less likely to show up to the protest in the first place. If you are afraid that tensions are so high at a moment that something could become a riot, then why even take the risk of coming out and exercising your First Amendment rights?
I want you to give your opportunity to get final thoughts before we take a break. But that's the common thing that from emails and calls that we've gotten into our newsroom, is that there's now a fear to even go and protest in the first place.
And again, if you read the law, the fear should not be there. And I understand why some may have that fear, but the fear is not founded on what was passed in HB 1. Here's who should be fearful: the knuckleheads who join these protests, who plan on harming our police officers. The knuckleheads who come in and try to burn down a business. The knuckleheads who try to intimidate diners. The knuckleheads who try to block traffic. And the knuckleheads who try to destroy monuments. And the knuckleheads in government who try to defund our police. That's the chilling effect. They should be chilled. And to make sure that they know that these actions are going to have consequences. And you know what it does? It makes us safer as a community when these people chill.
You mentioned defund the police. I want to dive into that because that in itself has been very controversial every time people hear those words, defund the police. We're going to talk about that after the break. You're watching Justice for All Beyond the Cut. Welcome back to Justice for All Beyond the Cut. We've been having a very lively discussion about Florida's new anti-riot law. I know that you're watching at home, you're like, we want more, we want more. I'm sad to say that we're almost done, but we are going to dive into at least one more topic here. Before going to break, Bernie, you mentioned defunding the police. That has been talked about for so long. I feel like there's so many misconceptions and misinformation when it comes to that. So briefly, just for our viewers watching at home, like, explain what it means when we say defund the police.
Defunding the police means just that. It's taking funds away from our men and women in blue who protect and serve every day. I had the pleasure of working with these fine men and women as a state prosecutor and saw the tough job that they did day in and day out, and I have a high respect for it. And what I don't like, and I think a lot of people in our community, not just conservatives, a lot of people don't like when this whole profession is trashed and taken down just because of an incident that may have occurred, and to try to trash the whole profession and then lead it into policy, which is the defunding movement and taking funds. You know, a lot of the supporters try to say, oh, that's not what we mean. Well, it's clear as day. And it's what has been done in places like Seattle. You had a situation in Portland and Seattle. In Seattle, the black female police chief had enough and she resigned. You know, a decorated almost 30 years in the force, rose her way up to the Seattle Police Department, became the chief. And as she was tasked with an important job in trying to quell civil unrest and rioting, violent protests, the things she got is her city council defunded and took funds away from her department. This is what we're talking
about.
about.
Do you agree with that definition?
No. Defund the police is actually less about the police and more about communities and how are communities invested in. Police are a body that responds to crime, that responds to things that happen after the fact. They don't prevent them by and large. Whereas Defund the Police seeks to make sure that there's investment in the community that takes preventative measures. It's not a secret that over the last 30 years, police budgets in cities have skyrocketed. They are now the largest priority for any city budget. In St. Pete, it takes up about $117 million. Defund the Police asks us to look at the priorities of a city and consider, is investing in youth services and after-school programs, is investing in affordable housing, is investing in mental health care a better solution to making sure that crime doesn't happen than only focusing on what happens once crime does? And it's a question of priorities. I'm not here to have a conversation about the function of the police. I'm here to have a conversation about, are our communities made safer by making sure that children don't go to sleep at night hungry, that they have access to a quality education, that people have access to good jobs, that people have access to mental health counseling to prevent crises that make the police necessary. And at the end of the day, you know, whether or not the tagline defund the police is polarizing or not, the same 81% of people who would disagree with the language of defund the police, the inverse is true when you ask about how they want their communities invested in, whether or not they want to have access to capital, whether or not they want to see their children have something to do after school other than to get up and into trouble. And we see that because when the language changes, the priorities become clear. By and large, people don't want crime to happen in their communities. They want safety. What provides safety is the question of defund the
Bernie,
police.
real quick, I see you want to respond.
Yeah, real quick. Yeah, all those things are good. The reason why the inverse is true, you know, capital investment, quality education, you know, youth services, preventative measures are all great. The issue is the activists want to take that funding away from the law enforcement and basically shift it. Why not an all of the above approach where you can prioritize both? You know, this is not something you have to pick and choose. You can have priorities in your budget, and you can prioritize both law enforcement and community services, and not.
The reality is the choice has been police. That's my point.
Well,
the reality is in cities across America over the last 30 years, we have seen an intentional choice to divest from those types of programs and invest instead in policing. That is the choice in which municipalities made, and voters should have the right to impact how they want their money spent. That is why we have elections. If a municipality decides that they want to see more investment in community, then they should have that right. What this law preempts and prevents is democracy from actually winning the day, that voters no longer get to make a choice about that investment or divestment, that now the governor or the state legislature gets to make that choice.
Investing in communities. Today we're doing that by investing in this conversation to help move us forward. When we come back from the break, we're going to do that. We're going to do just that with our final thoughts on where do we go from here. You're watching Justice for All Beyond the Cut. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Justice for All Beyond the Cut. We're about to wrap up our latest installment. We've been having a discussion on HB1, Florida's new anti-riot law. Bernie, Representative Driscoll, thank you so much for giving us your time today. I would like to end with just our final thoughts of today's discussion. For our viewers watching at home, we gave them a lot to think about, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of good information of what HB1 is and isn't. Just your final thoughts to our viewers of what they need to know, and just how do we move forward now from here?
And first of all, thank you for facilitating this important discussion and for hosting this. This is, I think, was very productive, and I think despite your views on a particular issue, I think exchanges like this will go a long way, for our communities and for our state. So thank you. What I want our viewers to take away from this is just to have these discussions. Number one, read the law even, and it's there. Representative Driscoll mentioned at myfloridahouse.gov, and you can go there and look at the bill and read it for yourself. Read different articles, read different viewpoints on the bill. But don't allow people who are seizing this opportunity to divide, to instill fear. Certain activists do that. And they want to make sure that there's always some kind of grievance and there's always some kind of somebody's going to come after you. I think we should really push back against that and just dial it back and know what this law does. You do not need to be in fear if you are going to a protest, if you do not plan on looting, burning, intimidating, causing violence to others and law enforcement officers, and blocking roadways. You do not need to be in fear if you are not going to defund our brave men and women in law enforcement. And this is what this law addresses.
Representative Driscoll, your final thoughts.
Thank you. Again, thank you for the conversation and for having us here today. I guess my takeaway would be, or my hope for the future, the viewers, in addition to them being informed and having these conversations, I agree on that. I feel like I'm elected to go to Tallahassee to serve all of you and to work on serious issues and to do serious work. And this was not a good example of that. A better example of that is when we work together to actually pass meaningful reforms that will help support just and fair policing, both uplift our law enforcement community that does such a great job of helping keep us safe every day, and also bridging connections to communities that don't always feel like they're policed fairly. I feel like we do good work when we pass a budget that's providing relief to families and to small business owners so that they can get back on their feet. And to me, HB1 is such a distraction away from the real work. But please go out, read the bill, be informed, have conversation, but have conversation where you can try to listen to each other, and try to build those bridges even with the people who you may disagree with.
I want to thank you both again for giving us your time. I want to thank Cliff and Ashley that joined our conversation earlier for their time and their perspectives. For our viewers watching at home, I hope this discussion educated you a little bit. I hope it gave you the motivation to do, as Bernie said, to have conversations on your own. That's the whole purpose of Justice for All Beyond the Cut, to be able to come into your homes, to give you new perspectives, and to encourage you to have those conversations with your friends and with your family so that we can make our community, our state, and our nation a better place. Until next time, stay safe. Thank you for joining us for Justice for All Beyond the Cut.